Hello, everyone. Welcome along to another Nurse Recruitment Secrets webinar. Today, I'm so glad to be joined by Mukul Bakhshi. Mukul is going to be talking to us about international RN recruiting, and I feel so lucky to have met him. I bumped into Mukul at a conference for healthcare staffing earlier in the month, and it had been on my mind for a while. How can we plug the healthcare staffing shortage and how can international nurses come into that? So today he's going to be talking us through some of the market trends in international nurse recruitment, advice on how you can get started, ongoing challenges to recruiting international nurses, how to prepare those nurses for credentialing, and then emerging technologies that are improving the process. So I'm going to throw it over to Mukul to tell you all a little bit more about himself and CGFNS, for which he's the Chief Global Affairs Officer.
Thank you so much, Adam, and it was a pleasure to meet you at the conference and great to speak with all of you today. So as Adam mentioned, I'm the Chief Global Affairs Officer at CGFNS. I've been at CGFNS for 9 years in a variety of roles. I also serve as the Director of the Alliance for Ethical International Recruitment Practices, which is the division of CGFNS that's focused on ensuring that foreign educated nurses coming to the US are treated fairly and ethically. And at CGFNS, for those of you who don't know, CGFNS is a 46-year-old organization. We do credential evaluation for healthcare professionals looking to bring their skills and experience to the U.S., Canada, and New Zealand. And so in the United States specifically, we kind of have two major programs that if you do international recruitment, you'll probably be impacted by. One is the Visa Screen program, which is a requirement by USCIS for healthcare professionals who are seeking an occupational visa to come to the US. And the other is our Credential Evaluation Service Report, which is a requirement by a lot of state boards of nursing for licensure. So we are kind of in a unique position where we are serving the global healthcare community, including employers, but by ensuring that those foreign educated nurses who are coming are properly qualified to conduct their practice here.
Mm. And I know that's a stumbling block for a lot of international nurses, so it'd be great to hear from you today. So, just quickly before we get started, I think the main interest whenever I started talking to you was how you would interface with government stakeholders, NGOs, as well as recruiters, because legislation and the political climate really impact this sourcing function. Could you
Yeah.
tell me a little bit more about that and how you would interact with decision makers at a government level?
Absolutely. So I interact pretty closely with the U.S. federal government and other governments quite regularly. Um, Through, particularly for the federal level, it's the USCIS, which is part of the Department of Health, Homeland Security, and focused on immigration, and then of course the Department of Health and Human Services, which deals a lot with the English language proficiency questions that are involved. So we're regularly talking to them on the kind of the efficacy of the program. Of course, a lot of this comes down to Congress, right? I know we're gonna talk later a lot about the visa availability issues that are going to become much more acute and may impact some of the listeners' decisions to engage in this type of recruitment. But CGFNS is not taking position currently on some of the legislation that's pending, but we're obviously
Mm.
regularly in conversation with recruiters and like the American Hospital Association and others who are advocating for more visas for healthcare professionals. And Congress obviously comes to us when there are questions specifically around some of the data that we have about some of this stuff. And just as a plug for us, on Monday, we're releasing our new 2023 nurse migration report, which provides a lot of data on some of these issues. So we'll have a
Oh,
webinar
okay.
Monday and then Wednesday, and happy to talk about some of those trends today as well.
Yeah. I mean, I'd love to jump into that. So our first point was market trends on the potential of internationally educated nurses. Like, To what extent do you think they can contribute to solving the nursing shortage in the US?
Yeah. So I think in the United States, and again, the U.S. is a different case than a lot of other Western countries that a lot of nurses come to for a variety of reasons. But in the U.S., it's a pretty small piece of the pie. Meaning, I think foreign educated nurses can be a piece of the solution, but the numbers and the demand for nurses is just way too large for the foreign educated piece to kind of fill it. Just to give you kind of perspective, the in the United States, we get about 1,500 applications a month for our visa screen program. Sounds like a decent amount, but that's a fraction. In your write up, you talk about there's 200,000 openings, so that's less than 10%
Mm,
right there. So it's going to be only a fraction. And just to put it in world context, we get 1,500 applications for the U.S. and New Zealand, which is the size of New Jersey, has almost double that, right? So
mm,
a country that's a 30th of the size of the United States has well more applications. So for the US, it's only going to be a really small piece of the solution. Now, for facilities that are considering it, I think there's absolutely lots of benefits to evaluating inclusion of international recruitment, but it's not going to
mm.
by any means solve or address the problem comprehensively.
So I know in the UK as well, the
Yeah,
proportion, and
yeah,
Ireland particularly, a lot
yeah,
more as a proportion of the population. Why in the US is it so low? What are some of the blockades that
yeah.
are keeping it down?
Yeah. So great question. So, what I often say is often when you talk about why there are shortages or things you think demand supply, that is not really the issue. There's plenty of demand by hospitals and healthcare facilities for nurses, including foreign educated nurses. And there's plenty of supply. Even today, when you talk to a lot of nurses who go to other countries, the US would be the top destination country of choice. The issue is the availability of visas to come to the United States. The
Mm,
U.S. does not have a specific healthcare visa. It hasn't had one for a long time for nurses. So it's part of the general pool of visas that are available, called
mm,
generally the EB visa, the being most common. And there was over the last couple of years additional visas available for a variety of reasons under the formula, partly because a lot of visas weren't used during the pandemic, and that extra supply is gone now. So essentially, there's these strong limitations that, unless there's legislative action,
mm.
which is relatively unlikely, that will preclude really having additional nurses come beyond that 20,000 or so that we've been talking about.
Okay. And do you think the absence of that healthcare visa is down to a lack of lobbying on the part of interest groups who would benefit from this, or something else?
It's definitely not a lack of lobbying. So I know the American Hospital Association and some of the large recruiters have assembled a coalition of organizations that are fighting for a bill right now that's pending called the Health Workforce Resilience Act that
Mm,
would, at least temporarily for the next 3 years, recapture 25,000 additional visas for nurses and 15,000 for doctors. So this is by no means some major kind of solution long term, but it is a significant step towards addressing some of these shortage issues. However, there's lots of dysfunction in Washington, particularly around immigration, and so I think will be some challenges in terms of getting that adopted. But you never know what could happen in the kind of last few weeks of the session when things are thrown into the continuing resolution process.
okay. Yeah, I mean, it just seems to me, I think because I'm in healthcare recruitment every day, that there would be an obvious benefit from editing the visa rules so that more nurses and doctors could come in. But that's because I'm in it every day. I mean, I'm not sure how high on the list of priorities it is. And I think that, like, well, you've seen it work in other countries, but um,
Yeah,
every system has its own
yeah.
intricacies, so it could explain things.
Yeah, I think there's lots of interest, and this bill in particular I mentioned has a lot of bipartisan support.
Hmm.
Whether it can get over the finish line is a different question, of course. I think many stakeholders want a full, comprehensive fix to our entirely broken immigration system,
Yeah.
and so um, getting something done can be a challenge. Even though I think everyone recognizes the critical impact that shortages have for healthcare facilities, but also for the patients that they serve. So
Yeah. Well, if anyone's listening, lobby your congressman,
yeah,
congresswoman if you support this bill, and yeah, search it up and get educated on it because this is the type of thing that I think we in the healthcare system lack sometimes. It's like the proactive solving of the problem.
yeah,
Do a lot of maybe complaining or struggling with the problem of the healthcare shortage, but in instances like this, it's going to be legislators that change the rules. So you have
yeah,
to really get out there and
yeah.
speak with them. Um, so I'd love to get your advice then on a facility, say director of recruitment who's listening to this and need more nurses, but currently only recruiting locally. How do they get started in recruiting nurses internationally?
Yeah, great question. And I think it's going to depend a lot to the listeners out there on your kind of individual situation, risk tolerance, timelines, things of that sort. So, even in the best of times, meaning earlier this year when there was no visa retrogression, it's still a pretty cumbersome process, I would say. At the very low end, we're talking about 6 months, so somewhere in the 6 to 18 month range, just to get through all the processes involved from the immigration side through the CGFNS process, licensure, et cetera. And then you have what's known as visa retrogression, which are these delays because of the lack of visa availability. And right now, for most of the world, we're talking about a 2 year additional wait. So all that's to say is there are a lot of challenges for a lot of healthcare facilities that are trying to do direct recruitment. Um, so I think one option is to kind of figure that out and figure out your risk tolerance. Another is to work with a staffing or placement firm, and those firms generally are certified by our Alliance for Ethical International Recruitment Practices if they agree to abide by certain practices of ethics and best practices. And that could be one option because they're pretty familiar with all the intricacies of this process. But I think the biggest question I would say for anyone listening is if you're trying to do this to kind of get a quick fix to
Mm,
your recruitment issues, this is probably the wrong uh, kind of wrong path to look at. However, if um, international recruitment can be a piece of a comprehensive long-term workforce solution that helps to kind of add to your diversity and enables kind of long-term growth within your kind of pipeline of people, there's absolutely a path there. And I think there are plenty of resources on our website and certainly out there to help people
mm.
navigate that process. But I think at the very least, even if you're not going to go with a recruiter, talking to some of them about the process and intricacies could be helpful as a starting point.
Yeah. I think, yeah, it's tempting to see it as something that could fix your problem immediately because you see
Yeah.
the world as your oyster. But
Right.
yeah, in our experience, we haven't seen anyone that is sad to us. Well, all their nurses are from the Philippines and we're
Right.
sorted. It's unfortunately it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
Um, so I know we were talking a little bit about the visa issues. What additional challenges would there be, say, working with the agency or trying to do it yourself that people should be aware of?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that surprises people who aren't familiar is the relative complexity of the process. So
Mm,
a lot of you on this listening today are probably thinking about the normal process and the credentialing of nurses and all that stuff. I would say take the process for a domestic nurse and multiply it by 5 or 10 in terms of difficulties.
mm,
The first part is the whole immigration process, and I kind of allude to the timelines, but there's the process of getting a background check. There's getting all the documents, um, tests like the nursing tests, a nursing test of nursing knowledge or a test of English, getting that all evaluated by an organization like CGFNS, and then getting the visa screen certificate. Then in concurrently also applying for licensure, and it's much more difficult than applying for normal license because you need a credential report from an agency like CGFNS. And so all those pieces, generally nurses and other healthcare professionals are looking for an employer to help or a recruiter to help them navigate that. And so
mm.
being familiar or working with someone who is familiar with that process can be really helpful in terms of navigating all those challenges. Because even when it works smoothly, it's relatively long and cumbersome, and certainly if there are challenges that arise because of documents, those can all be additional hiccups. that can kind of interrupt your workflow.
Hmm. So working with the experts,
I think that's the
I
good takeaway.
go to the experts. I would like to talk a little bit about Canada and Mexico because obviously they're in the NAFTA agreement and
Yeah,
there's not quite as many visa challenges. I know
yeah,
credentialing's still there. Now, I've spent a lot of time in Mexico, but I haven't seen many employers at all tap into the market of nurses over here. It'd be great if you could share some of the reasons for that
yeah.
and what you see as an opportunity to recruit nurses from Mexico and like how could it be done correctly?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a question I get a reasonable amount, right? Because as you allude to, Adam, when we were talking about those visa delays, we're really talking about the EB2 and EB3 categories, the green card visa categories, which are where most nurses are coming through. However, there's this whole TN category for those countries under the USMCA agreement, formerly known as the NAFTA agreement. And for Canada and Mexico, none of those delays apply, right? You can essentially receive a TN visa at the border when you're coming into work. And so it's a very different game in terms of those legislative difficulties. So for Canada, of course, Canada is a major source country for nurses to the United States. Lots of Canadian nurses come over, some permanently, some actually even commute across the border day to day. Um, and obviously Canada does have a very similar education, so credentialing is not really an issue for Canadian nurses. Mexico, on the other hand, I think if companies can figure out the way to get through that, that's obviously a really great source. There's no visa difficulties, etc. From the CGFNS side, as the evaluators, we get Mexico is not even a top 15 or 20 country for us in terms of the number of applicants that are coming from there. I think there are two challenges, and I think both are being addressed by some stakeholders, but how sufficiently we have not really seen as of yet. So one challenge, of course, is the education, right? I know there have been questions around comparability of education. We don't have general rules. We don't say Mexican nurses are comparable or not. These are
Mm.
all individualized assessments based on curriculum of an individual applicant. However, I think relative to some other countries that you mentioned, like Philippines or Canada, there have been larger numbers of Mexican educated nurses who've had challenges with the credential evaluation process and having their educational background deemed comparable to that of a U.S. nurse. The second,
Mm.
of course, is English language proficiency. The English language proficiency standards that are required for nurses and other healthcare professionals coming from most countries can be a challenge, and is probably one of the larger sources of difficulty. In the last couple of years, or last year and a half or so, there have been additional tests that have been available, and so I think there's been more move by those who maybe are borderline in terms of English language proficiency to get through that process. But for employers who are maybe listening, that creates an additional obstacle for you when making sure that the nurses who do come over are proficient enough in English to kind of effectively communicate with their colleagues on the floor and then with the patients as well.
Mm, okay. Can you have you got a business idea or a tip for how this kind of demographic could be activated? And what do you think would be the
I think the real key would be um, making filling bridging programs. So like if you want to go to that market, find out what the deficiencies are and find ways to bridge those deficiencies through coursework or other things, and
mm,
get people trained through that, and then get them through the process. I think there's certainly enough demand, and the lack of the restrictions on supply make Mexico a very interesting place
yeah.
to look at.
Yeah, certainly one for the future. I mean, I know here that uh English proficiency is improving.
Yep.
Historically, it's not been
Yep.
great. Like the education system hasn't really been sufficient on English, but as more people come across the border or leave and come back, that level is improving. And I know a lot of English teachers here, and some even working in schools. So
Yeah.
I think it's a definitely a growth market for everyone. I'm looking forward to see what happens there. So let's talk to the listeners who maybe have scheduled arrivals or they've already got this up and running and they've recruited internationally in the past and they want to improve their current process. Do you have uh, any suggestions on preparing nurses for credentialing? And I know you'll probably talk a little bit about CGFNS, but outside of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we're the primary drivers on the credentialing front, obviously, in the sense that most state boards of nursing are looking to our report to determine comparability of education and decide whether to issue a license. So I think CGFNS is probably the one that recruiters and employers are most considering, because once you get through that process, the rest kind of falls into place. I think the key things I would mention are really just looking up front, making sure education's comparable. You can kind of get an assessment pretty quickly by looking at people from similar schools and things of that sort, and see if they are able to get through that process pretty quickly. I would say, the credentialing front is really about what someone's brought to the table already before you've already dealt with them, frankly. And then, after that, it'd be like, what are the additional things beyond credentialing do I need to impart to this person so that they're successful in my workplace? And that includes both cultural and clinical orientation. So making sure you're providing sufficient modules and things of that sort to make sure that people are positioned to succeed once they get on that
Mm.
floor.
Yeah. And what are some of the common reasons for failure?
The failure of individuals integrating, or
Yeah, like going through the credentialing
through the
process.
credentialing process. So through credentialing process, I think it's generally there's the educational comparability component. So I think things like maternity or psychiatric care, which are required by a lot of states, might not be taught in all coursework, and so bridging programs can be a part there. If there's an issue of comparability more generally, then that can always be an obstacle if there's not the sufficient hours or things of that sort. English language proficiency, of course, is always a potential roadblock, and then of course
Mm.
the test of knowledge, whether it be the CGFNS qualifying exam or NCLEX passing, or getting prepared adequately to successfully take those tests. I think is the third component.
Right. Okay. Yeah, you're convincing me on the complication front.
Yeah,
Saying it's not a quick process.
yeah,
But I would I would love to hear a little bit more about the report that you mentioned, that the organization's bringing out,
yeah.
on the market trends. What are some of the highlights of that?
Yeah, great question. So last year was the biggest year ever for us. We're talking more than twice as many reports as just a couple years ago, 4 years ago. So I think when we're talking about a lot of the interest in this, it's because the last couple of years have been such major years for recruitment, probably unprecedented since the mid 2000s, frankly, 15 or 16 years since we've seen these types of numbers. So I think that's the biggest part of the story. And as I mentioned before, that's kind of on the end right
Mm.
now, and we're looking for a precipitous decline over the next year. I think that's a large part of the story. Another part of the story is actually, I've some of what I talked about may have sounded gloom and doom, and it was more not to say don't do this, but just be very thoughtful about some of the obstacles in doing it. And that is the improvement in timelines. So, things like getting through the process that might have taken a year just a couple years ago now take less than 5 or 6 months. So there's been a lot of effort to expedite the process, recognizing that the timelines and lags are, of course, bad for us because we want to get reports out to people, but bad for nurses who want to get to the workforce and for employers who want to get people on the floor. So a lot of effort there. That's another piece of the story as well. And I think the third thing that is kind of talked about, because we're providing a lot of global context on what's going on, is the divergence of the U.S. model from a lot of other countries, right? So I think if we talk about the pandemic and the post-pandemic period, I think the biggest takeaway is that political pressure a few years ago was patient safety, making sure regulators are really focused on ensuring that nurses and other health professionals are well qualified to do their jobs, right? That was the primary emphasis. In the last couple of years, in most countries, the desperation to get people to the floor has meant that the political pressure is really, yeah, we know you have to care about patient safety, but don't let that hold back getting nurses to the floor, right? It's much more important to get people there quickly and expedite and streamline the processes. That's been a huge theme in countries like Canada and the UK and Ireland, you mentioned, New Zealand. In the United States, all those voices have been much more muted. I mean, there's certainly advocates for more nurses and to expedite, streamline the processes, but we've seen nothing here like we've seen elsewhere, both in terms of the kind of
Mm.
the vocal discussion around these issues, and then of course, most importantly, around action to address those and to streamline the process or increase availability of visas and things of that sort. So all three of those things I think were highlighted well in this report.
Mm. American exceptionalism at play, but
Totally.
sometimes, yeah, sometimes I don't know. Are you able to say? Do you think it's a worse situation in the U.S. than those other countries, or
Oh, worse in what sense?
um? And I suppose in a sense of efficiency, the system being set up to solve problems like this.
Yeah, I think that's right. So
Yeah,
I think the difference is a lot of other countries have public systems, right? So the
yeah,
political pressure is much more acute to address the shortage. Obviously, here it's a private system, primarily lots and thousands of employers around the country. And so, in one ways, the shortages have been less because there have been market kind of forces, like through domestic recruitment, travel nurses, and things of that sort, to fill gaps. And on the other hand, there's not been the same kind of full government structure to kind of address those
mm,
concerns. So I think
yeah,
the fixes have been harder, and our immigration politics are particularly challenging as well. And I think that has been an issue too. So I think there are lots of issues that have meant that both in terms of our structure that we're almost better suited to deal with a lot of those problems, but that has meant
mm,
that international recruitment isn't the same piece of the solution as it is for the UK, where it's almost critical to getting nurses to the bedside, for example.
yeah, yeah. And we don't really have travel nursing per se, so
Right.
uh, be great. Let's just make a country that combines the best of everything. Well, though, so before we go, I would love to just get your take on technology coming in and changing, improving the process. Is there any emerging tech that you see that could make this easier for facilities or international nurses over the next 5, 10 years?
Absolutely. I think you're going to see a critical juncture here. You know, when I came to CGFNS, I came from the consulting world and like McKinsey and Company and smaller firms, really focused on a lot of the kind of the innovation space and kind of the future Internet of Things. And then I come to a process that was pretty much caught in the 90s.
Mm,
And I think we're this area is very ripe for disruption in a lot of ways. So let me talk about a couple of them. One is the credentialing process, right? The credentialing process is still very much like paper based. We get credentials mailed to us from around the world. We look at them. We say, do they match? We look at seals and signatures to make sure they're authentic. Authentic. Very old school. I think you're going to move to things like digital credentials and things of that sort. But that's just the starting point, and maybe AI to evaluate them. The real thing is that in a technological world, you don't have to look at input based assessment as much. You can look at output based assessment as much. So things like certifications and portable credentials, I think, are going to be a major shift that will give healthcare professionals much more flexibility to decide how they want to use their credentials instead of getting specific reports for specific regulatory bodies. So I think that is a major shift. We'll see first that first thing, which is just streamlining the current process and making it quicker, but then moving away from kind of this input based credential evaluation process for specific uh, regulators and move towards portable credentials. Then, from the
mm,
perspective of healthcare facilities, right, right now, there's a lot of challenges around assessment. We talked a little bit or touched on, how do we make sure people are successful? It's not just through the credentialing process, but making sure they're successful when they get to the healthcare facility, right? I think there's a significant minority. I mean, of course, most people have a very positive experience, but a good number of healthcare professionals, particularly those coming from abroad, have challenges when they come to a healthcare facility, anywhere in the country, and those are both for just integration reasons, but also from a clinical perspective. And as some of those tools I talked about develop, including kind of virtual clinical competence, those will give HR directors at hospitals more tools to evaluate candidates and say, hey, I don't just have a transcript or a licensure test. I can actually look and see what are the skills that someone can bring to the table, and that could revolutionize hiring. So I think there's been a lot of
Mm,
changes the last few years, but it's going to be much more pronounced in the next 5 or 10.
yeah, definitely it's the ones that are stuck maybe in the 90s or the 2000s that can take the biggest leap forward because there hasn't
Exactly.
been, I mean, so much competition almost on the tech side. So there's
Yeah.
greater opportunity there. That's really interesting. I'd love to see some companies that are coming out on that.
Yeah.
So before we go, is there any tips or key advice that you want people to walk away with and remember after listening to this?
Yeah, I would say, you said it right. Look at the experts. The other thing I would say is look at your timeline. Really be critical about what are you looking to solve for. I think international recruitment can be a great piece of a long-term strategy if it makes sense for you, but try to avoid the quick fix approaches because those don't generally work. I think would be my
Right.
ultimate takeaway.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mukul. And if anybody would like to learn a little bit more about what Mukul does, just look him up,
Yeah,
Mukul Bakhshi on LinkedIn, or you can search CGFNS.
perfect.
So thanks for joining us, and we look forward to our next guest. Subscribe, follow us on YouTube if you'd like to get more content, and have a great week. Thanks
Great.
for coming, Mukul.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Bye.
Appreciate it.